U.S. President Donald Trump says all options are on the table after the DPRK fires another missile. And the President and First Lady traveled to Texas to learn firsthand about recovery efforts after a powerful storm brings record rainfall and devastating flooding. Hello, I'm John Terrett, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello. The President and First Lady, Melania Trump, received a briefing in Corpus Christi, Texas on Tuesday in what is expected to be a long and costly recovery from Hurricane Harvey. The storm has dumped more than 130 centimeters of rain and has brought heartbreak to thousands. Officials have rescued more than 3,000 people and over 17,000 are now in shelters. After the briefing, Trump addressed first responders and residents who'd come out to see him.
I will tell you, this is historic, it's epic what happened, but you know what? It happened in Texas, and Texas can handle anything. Thank you all, folks. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, with Trump focused on the natural disaster, the DPRK is once again testing the patience of the United States and the international community with another ballistic missile test. Beijing is calling on Pyongyang to suspend missile tests while urging the U.S. and the Republic of Korea to halt joint military exercises, the so-called freeze. So to discuss all of this, we're joined by Afshin Molavi. He's a senior fellow with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Ansgar Graw is a senior political correspondent with the German newspaper Die Welt, joins us from Berlin. Also with us is Joe Madison. He's a talk show host with Sirius-XM's Urban View channel. It's a national radio station in this country, also a civil rights activist. And joining us from Tampa, Florida, is Dan Perkins. And Dan is an author and a commentator. Welcome to you all. Let's go to you, Afshin, first of all. So Japan is the subject of this latest DPRK missile test. The missile goes right over Japan and lands in the Pacific. The White House puts out a statement, all options on the table. So for you, what are all options?
Well, it seems that President Trump has certainly imbibed the presidential stock phrase, all options are on the table. But what they don't note is what options are more prominently displayed on that table. And when you talk to Trump administration officials, I mean, these are sober, senior national security intellectuals like, Secretary James Mattis, H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor. The diplomacy option is most prominently featured on the table because they understand the enormous tragedy that could come to the Korean Peninsula with rash military action. Seoul is 40 miles away from North Korean missiles. One thing that was interesting, though, about this particular missile test, it was not a long-range missile. It was a short-range missile. Certainly provocatively went over Japan. But Trump administration officials will tell you privately that, maybe Richard Nixon's madman theory is at play here. When you have an erratic president like Donald Trump, maybe the adversary is thinking twice about doing another long-range missile test. But, never count out Kim Jong-un willing to test the U.S. president.
So, Ansgar Graw in Berlin, it seems then that diplomacy is still very much on the table, but the Security Council just a handful of weeks ago imposed draconian sanctions again on Pyongyang. I believe they centered around minerals and seafood exports amounting to about $1 billion, and yet nothing seems to have changed the leadership's mind. If that doesn't, what will?
Yeah, that's a big question. But I think one problem in this topic is that President Trump seems to overestimate the means, the tools, the influence of Beijing and China in regard to Pyongyang and North Korea. He thinks if China just decides that Pyongyang has to stop these missile development, then Pyongyang will do so, but he underestimates that Pyongyang and China are also rivals and they are close neighbors, but they are not politically very close. And therefore, I think one of the problems is that President Trump doesn't really understand the nature of this behavior of North Korea.
There is a theory, of course, Ansgar, isn't there, that because this missile went over Japan, I think for the first time, and landed in the Pacific, that this may stir a movement within Japan to actually have a proper army, a proper military, rather than just the defense force that they've had after the Second World War, and that might actually prompt China to work even harder than it is to try and convince Pyongyang to stop this. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think it was the second time that there was a North Korean missile flying over Japan. But you're right, there are reactions in Japan, and but nevertheless, I would repeat my former advice. Beijing, even if Beijing would decide that Pyongyang and Kim should stop their behavior and change their behavior, also China has not so much means. And back then, when Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, I think there would have been time and the possibility for a preemptive strike of the United States against Pyongyang, but this chance is gone for a very long time. And today, it is good if Japan, for example, also strengthens its muscles, for example, and show Kim and shows Pyongyang that they won't accept this threat from North Korea. But I think there is at this time from no side there is a way to have a military solution.
Afshin, what do you make of what Ansgar is saying? In America, everybody believes, because we are told by the media, that the onus to solve this problem is really on Beijing's shoulders, because Beijing is so close to Pyongyang. Ansgar saying not necessarily so.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that we immediately assumed that Beijing could snap its fingers and Kim Jong-un would act. Well, Beijing has been trying to push the North Korean leadership towards the China model of economic growth, export-led industries for about, a decade or so. But, the various regimes in North Korea have decided to, employ much more of a Stalinist model that shows absolute callous disregard for the welfare of their people. So I agree with that.
Let's bring in Dan Perkins. Dan's down in Florida. When the North Koreans, the DPRK, fired a missile recently, President Trump was quick to tweet out about fire and fury raining down on their head. And yet this time round, the White House, he didn't tweet, and the White House took 12 hours to put out a statement in which they said all options are on the table. Do you read anything into that, Dan?
Well, John, thank you for having me on. No, I don't read anything particular. I think right now the president is concerned about the people in Texas and making sure that all the power of the federal government is in place. I do think he is concerned, and he has cabinet officers who are not involved in the flooding, who are looking and seeing what is it they can do. You might recall shortly after Mr. Trump gave his fire and fury speech, there was a long period of time when North Korea did not do any testing, and the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said to the world, maybe there's an opportunity for diplomatic relations to come together and solve this problem. Now we have North Korea sending a missile over the Japanese countryside. That's a serious, serious breach. So it seems as if Mr. Kim does not want to deal with any diplomatic issues. He wants to continue to threaten the United States. And I agree with the other guest that the idea that China can snap its fingers, China accounts for 90% of the exports out of Korea, and it's still is still fighting. One of the things that we have to be careful of is that if we're talking about fire and we're talking about the possibility of regime change in North Korea, who's going to be the replacement? And we don't know that at the moment, and because of the closed nature of the Korean society, we don't know who the next person is. So there are a lot of unanswered questions here that we have to be very careful with.
And Ashwin, finally on the DPRK, Kim Jong-un didn't fire that missile at Guam. He fired it into the Pacific over Japan. Now, you know, in a way, that's a change of policy, right, from him?
It is. It's in a way, I mean, it's almost, some analysts are referring to this as almost a de-escalatory missile test. Whereas what would have been really escalatory is if he had fired it close to Guam.
Yeah. Let's move on. Hurricane Harvey is the other topic that involves the president. He's in Texas right now. He's visited Corpus Christi today and Austin, but he's steered clear of anywhere where the real disaster recovery is still going on around Houston. Joe Madison, the president's response so far, all yours.
Well, I mean, the response has been presidential. I mean, you know, going to this area is exactly what presidents are supposed to do. He was smart enough not to go into the ravaged, flooded areas because it would have taken more resources.
Are you happy with the fact that cable media is portraying it as a real victory for the White House and the president, a really good move?
I don't consider it as cable news portraying it as a real victory. I mean, that, to me, quite honestly, that's an absurd position. There's no victory when you have 30, maybe up to 60,000 people that are going to be in shelters. You still have possibly more rain and flooding that's going to take place. There's no victory here. There's a lot of suffering that's going on. I suspect tomorrow morning what I'll be dealing with is the fact that his wife showed up in stilettos and the fact that, and I think it was absolutely one of the most absurd things to say, and that is, look how large the crowd is. Look, you don't talk like that as a president. This is not a political rally. I'm here to find out how serious this issue is, what resources I can bring to it, and he also should be saying what he hopes Congress will do, because there's some serious issues there. You have Texas senators and members of Congress who, by the way, remember, didn't vote for flood relief and damage relief when Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast.